of the topics that we cover, things that I have taught on in a variety of ways over the last, since 2019, are these. That's reasonable faith. Okay, Ratio Christi, the organization that you guys are here tonight. This is the man who starts it. I'm really fortunate to have connected with Dr. Corey Miller. He has actually gone back and forth with me several times on the presentation we're going through tonight. And we meet on a regular basis. And so we speak on a regular basis. So I'm very thankful for him. He's got 3 master's degrees, so he's a show off, and a PhD. Because if you surround yourself with excellence, hopefully it rubs off on you. Ratio Christi's vision statement is this: more campus focused. That's why we're having this meeting tonight. The things I do with reasonable faith are more community focused. I've given talks as to city leaders, and I do a lot more with like businesses and churches. With reasonable faith, with Ratio Christi, usually I'm at the university talking to students. Okay. And then here's the mission statement of Ratio Christi. I chose to join Ratio Christi formally November, I think it was, something like that. I have been walking alongside a campus in Colorado Springs for a number of years. I don't know if you guys know some of the litigations that are happening around Ratio Christi. Colorado Springs was one of the worst ones, I thought, in the country. So I walked them through that for several years, walked them through the whole smearing campaign, walked them through winning against the Regency. So I've been around. I formally chose to join in November. So now I have even less time. This is a little bit about myself. As you can see, Colorado State at the top. And then I'm, like I said, 3 months away from the first master's degree. I say first because I've been in a seminary program for 18 months. And Lord willing, if the money comes in, I have further aspirations. My wife's made it very clear, no more out of my own pocket. So that's, when the wife says that, that's gospel. So that's not gonna happen. But I've been a lifetime learner, and I have enjoyed learning. But as you can see, my background has been more analytical in nature. And that's why at first blush, you might think, well, how does that tie into this space? Hopefully I can demonstrate how I think being an analyst has aided me in thinking through this subject. I'm the co-founder of a company called JA Legacy. This is our mission statement, and this is what, or our vision, and here's our mission statement. We spend time doing things like consultations on leadership for different clients, and then data science type events. We also own some subsidiary like cleaning businesses and things on the side. So that's us. Okay, as it relates to tonight, in necessarius unitas and non necessarius libertas, in omnibus caritas. Does anyone know who said this term? And what it means? Obviously you know what it means. I have it in English, not just Latin. Does anyone know who said it? Well, the answer is at the bottom. It was a non-distinguished German theologian by the name of Ruperus Meldenius. I put this up first because I value this. I value healthy conflict. I value the idea that we won't agree in all things, on the things that I share. In the essentials, hopefully we can agree, right? That's why I asked you in the beginning. Hopefully everyone thinks racism is bad. If not, that makes it kind of tricky. But in the non-essentials, there's liberty, right? And in all things, there's charity. First thing I want to hit tonight is kind of my course outline. I'm gonna see if I can make my little guy here go back up, because then you could see my title a little bit better. That's fine. He might not choose to play nice. We'll adapt. So here's the outline for tonight. We'll start with what is critical theory. So critical race theory, gender theory, sexuality theory, or offsprings of the parent, critical theory. So we'll talk about what that is. Do a quick little history lesson on that, and then we'll talk about some integration. Do a little history lesson on where it applies to critical race theory, do a quick little overview there. And then I'm going to start to make cases. So this is where my approach really differs a lot from Ibrahim Kendi and some of the big names in this space, is that I actually propose formal argumentation for my stance, to where, and I try to do so in a deductive way, so that hopefully one day I allow my arguments to be highly scrutinized. I'm constantly keeping them in front of my peers and other scholars, so that I can try to make it your intellectual obligation to accept my conclusions unless you can defeat a premise, right? That's kind of the case there. So I'll present a case at this point that's not mine. Actually, I got to interview, I've had the privilege over the last 12 months of interviewing some of the highest rated thinkers in the world. They're up all up on our YouTube page. I actually just last couple weeks ago interviewed Dr. Kaiman Kwan. Don't know who he is. He's a student of Richard Swinburne. Great interview. Hope to post that soon. So he shared with me something I found very interesting. So I'll share some of that tonight. An interview that I drafted an option of the moral argument. I'll present later. And then another argument I drafted probably 4 years ago. I'll present at the end. And then some closing thoughts. So this is the outline. But the way that this flows is entirely up to you guys. If you guys don't want to say anything and want to just stare at me, I've taught high school students, like I can do silence really, really well. I'll just talk and we'll go home and just have our bellies full. But if you guys feel like something jumps out to you, if something you got a burning question, there is a formal Q&A type thing at the end if you can hold it. But if not, I will regularly check in with you guys and see what's on your minds. Okay, if we don't make it past point one because there's just a ton of stuff going on, that's fine with me. You guys just have to convince Noah to bring me back. So that's just how we do that. Okay. Like I said, I apologize about I'm not used to having that at the top. But what this slide says is rules of engagement. So this is how we flow through this. I've done this enough to where I've seen these things happen. So I've built these based off of experience and observation. I don't say if your energy goes up. I'm going to be very direct on some things that relates to race. So when your energy goes up, my ask is to check in with yourself and ask yourself this question: is what I'm about to say or do going to come across as respectful? Right? That's kind of an ask that I have, just to honor everybody in the room. It's okay to share if you don't feel comfortable. This is something like I said, I've witnessed. I've had to protect people who have been kind of called out by other people. So I've done this with all races, various ages. The next point, the rule of engagement: dialogue, challenging and confronting each other is encouraged so long as it's factual and respectful. There's respect again. Disrespecting other people's boundaries will not be tolerated. Healthy conflict is like my spirit animal. So it's really, really important that as a culture, we relearn how to do healthy conflict. Does that make sense? I think we're really good at unhealthy conflict in this culture, and it just ruins everything. But learning how to respectfully engage is a lost art that I think would solve a lot of problems. So it's actually encouraged whenever I do anything. I encourage you to engage mentally, even if you're uncomfortable. So the reason why I said my second point about me resisting labels is because you're going to be tempted when you see certain things to have a reaction, okay? And that reaction may tempt you to shut down. I'm challenging you to challenge yourself, just to stay with me. Does that make sense? Can you guys all hang in there with me? Okay, so that's good. And then lastly, it is critical to be precise when you're speaking in what I call hot waters, right? So everyone talks about the big three: sexuality, religion, and politics. Obviously, you can break those down into gender, religion, or race theory and things like that. For me, I find it's very, very helpful to try to be very careful what you say when you're in hot waters, right? When we're talking about anything that people find very controversial. Oh, and lastly, emotionalism can overpower even the smartest of us. If you don't believe that, get married. Okay, so the next thing is just getting started. So let's just jump in. Gosh, you'll have to bear with me. I'm a very transparent person, so I will often reflect how I'm feeling out into the room. And I really wish I could get this thing to go away. I feel like I did something to make this thing mad at me. Oh wait, maybe I could just do that to him. Little problem solving there. It's not bad. Okay, so we're going to talk about the difference between the intellectual history and the sociology of knowledge. Thank you, sir. You get the golden star. You are now my favorite. We're going to talk about the difference between the intellectual history versus the sociology of knowledge. Does that do anything to the Zoom? Is the Zoom still going? Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to make sure you're still my favorite. So have you guys heard these terms before? Intellectual history versus the sociology of knowledge as it relates to a concept. Okay. That's, if you haven't, that's fine. Whenever you're dealing with grammar, right? There's two ways to approach a word. What a word connotes versus what a word denotes. You guys familiar with that type of language? You following that? It's a little harder to, so a connotation is like a cultural understanding of a word. If I ask you, what does the word bad mean, right? There's the dictionary definition, but our culture has used that in a positive sense. Like, oh, he's she's a bad chick, right? Which could be a compliment to a woman, right? Even though that differs from the definition, right? So it's harder to find what a concept denotes. Does that make sense? Because concepts evolve over time. So what I'm going to try to do is follow how this concept has evolved over time in two ways. By its logical factors, by its rational factors, which is the intellectual history, versus its non-rational factors, which is the sociology of knowledge. Okay, I'll try to show you how both things came about in this presentation. Okay, so first question I have for you is, do we understand those with whom we claim to disagree? I'm certain all of you in the last 12 months has had a conversation about race at some point. And I'm also certain that in your conversations about race, you disagreed with someone. Is that a fair assessment? Do we understand those with whom we claim to disagree? I start with Apostle Paul because before we go into critical theory, I love how in his letters, especially in this one to the church in Corinth in the first century, he talks about, man, my life has been really rough. In other words, he says, I've been oppressed. I have undergone suffering. I've undergone persecution. And he's kind of a good lightning rod for us because we all know that his life was above reproach based off what we know about him, right? So there's not really this argument of like, oh, well, he suffered because he sucks, right? No, he went through bad things because on his moral journey, the powers that be didn't like what he was about, right? The Roman Empire didn't like what he stood for in the face of what they were trying to accomplish. The same thing with the sectarian first century Jewish kind of ideological background. Does that make sense? So the concept of suffering is an old one, right? And that's kind of what critical theory says. In the 1920s in the Frankfurt School, though Marxism was kind of the stewing pot that raised its hand and said, I'll adopt this child, it was really the voice of people saying, I'm going through things I don't like. I'm going to go quickly through these slides because it's kind of like ungodly to have a lot of text on a PowerPoint. So when I show a lot of text, I just highlight certain things and I move very fast. Yes, sir.
I've heard the origins of critical theory. Someone else linked it to Hegel, and that Marxism also is linked to a kind of neo-Hegelianism, a sort of interruption of the dialectic. What say you on that?
Yeah, I think that if you bear with me for a moment, you might come to see that I might touch on that a little bit. But for the purpose of where we're going, what's relevant to our topic tonight, I have to get to critical race theory. So I'm only going to run through the parent ideology, but you and I can have a follow-up about critical theory because I'm very fascinated by its origins as well. But just for the sake of our dialogue for tonight, just to honor the time, I want you to read what's in yellow. Okay, I want you to just read what's in yellow. There was an outcry that said what we're seeing around us in the economy isn't right. Okay, let's keep moving. Modern critical social theories draw on numerous sources beyond this school, though. So this is what gets into your questions. Numerous sources, but they all kind of have this same context. Notice, feminist theory, queer theory, race theory, all begin to be born kind of from this same period. And this is where people get stuck. They see those words and they shut down. And they're like, oh yeah, I don't agree with that. That's not the point. The point was all of these things started to be born in the same time period where we're in the 20th century and people are starting to become very unhappy with the things they see around them, especially politically. You guys with me on that? Okay. Now, if we move to a more contemporary place, I don't have anything highlighted here because I'm just going to talk through this one really quick. I have a few things bolded though. This slide shows you a few terms that usually people get stuck on. Things like white privilege, white fragility, colorblind racism, intersectionality. These terms were popularized. And in my opinion, this is where the conversation became derailed because those terms came up and people were like, well, that doesn't apply to me, or I don't agree with that. And so the conversation kind of fell off and something was missed. But the reason why I brought this point in, that critical theory of resistance is similar to I do, is because a belief that things have a set of characteristics which make them what they are, and that the task of science and philosophy is their discovery and expression, The doctrine that the essence is prior to the existence. That's essentialism. Critical theory doesn't espouse to that. So what I have begun to articulate is that people actually don't know what critical theory is. Read here at the top. Particular manifestations of critical theory most relevant to contemporary culture, hence are labeled contemporary critical theory. Most people only know this. And so whenever anyone talks about race or critical theory, the conversation shuts down. But critical theory, as it denotes, remember I said we're going to try to talk about what people think it means versus what it actually means. As it denotes, it actually resists being defined in one way. So tonight I hope to expand your understanding of the word. Critical theory, by its own admission, kind of has three core components. And we're still on critical theory, not critical race theory. The first one is identity. Okay. According to critical theory, oppression should additionally or even be primarily understood in terms of hegemonic powers. I'm not going to camp here yet, because I don't think we've gone far enough to have this conversation yet. But first, I want you to know that there's three things that make the parent of critical race theory what it is: identity, liberation. Since its inception, critical theory has been primarily concerned with the elimination of oppression. Is there anyone in here who is opposed to eliminating oppression? Or do you all think we should eliminate oppression? Is everyone okay if we eliminate oppression? Okay, just check. Okay. So far we're all tracking with this, right? That oppression is bad, okay? Here's the third aspect of critical theory. We're not at race theory yet, we're still at critical theory. And this is where it gets very interesting. The oppressor does not perceive their monopoly on having more as a privilege which dehumanizes others. Okay, watch this. They cannot see that. More and more, the oppressors are using science and technology as unquestionably powerful instruments for their purpose, the maintenance of the oppressive order. Now, I put that up there to tell you how critical theory defines itself. But I am not up yet saying that I support this. I just want you to know the three things that make critical theory what it is. The next time you hear anyone say anything about critical theory, this is what it stands for. It stands for identity. It tries to identify what is one's relationship in society to power. It tries to figure out who is oppressed and how do we help them. And then it tries to say what has happened to the perspective of the one in power. You guys still tracking with me? Okay, still fairly simple.
Where do you get this quote? Because like what I'm finding some is, even as I've defined, when I define critical theory, they're just like, well, that's not what it is. Presenting what you've said in the sense so far.
You might find this interesting, but a lot of these materials from the beginning were produced by Ratio Christi. Dr. Miller produced a book called Engraving Critical Theory and the Social Justice Movement 2 years ago. And this is a direct quote from his book. So if you haven't read Dr. Miller's book, I'd highly recommend. That's part of the reason why he and I correspond on this so often, is because of the work he's done in this space. So for those of you that have been around Ratio Christi for a while, Ratio Christi released a book on this that I thought was very enlightening. Okay, so that's why I would recommend you go for that. Okay, so we came out the backside. Now you have a broad understanding of critical theory. I don't want to camp there long, because that conversation can go all night, which is not a bad thing, but it's not the point of tonight. Okay, so the first question I asked you was, do you understand those who disagree with you? So if someone comes to you and they seem to be promoting queer theory or intersectionality or feminist theory on the backs of a critical theory, that was their origin story. Like that's where it all branched from. And at its core, it's trying to say, how do we right injustice at its core? Does that make sense? Things can get off base, but that's the core. They may not be representing it properly, but that's the core. The next question I have is, do we understand where we overlap? So not if you understand them, but do you know where you integrate? So there's a few integrations that this ideology has with many, many others. Number one, its core concern is recognizing oppression is bad. Many ideologies recognize oppression is bad. Does that make sense? So it's important for you to go into these conversations knowing you have a lot in common, right? Because you also don't want to be oppressed anyway. The second thing that they believe, that I hope you and other people believe, is that power can corrupt your view of reality. I don't think that that's a controversial statement. Do you guys feel like that's a controversial statement? I don't think that it is. Because if I handed you $1 trillion, you would change as a person, right? Like your view of life would change very drastically. So this is a second piece of integration between critical theory, not critical race theory, critical theory, the parent, and other ideologies. Third, maybe more controversial, but I think it's a historical fact. Hegemonic powers are a real phenomenon. If any of you have worked at a job before, have you guys heard this phrase? The good old boys club. You ever heard that phrase? Can somebody tell me just real quickly what that phrase means? Someone says, oh, well, there's a good old boys club in there. You, sir, go ahead.
Usually it's just a bunch of people have been together to often keep things the way it is, or keep things in like, usually it's in a negative way.
Right, but it's a group of people that have found power in some, let's say you get hired at Home Depot, right? And the head guy's been there for like 25 years, and the guy next to him been there for like 15, right? And so now any chance you have a promotion in the Home Depot goes through Bob. It doesn't matter if you are the best worker in there. Bob doesn't like you, doesn't matter. You're not getting promoted, right? That's what we mean when we say the good old boys club. You know what that's called? Hegemony. That is a corrupted power system that is not meritocratic. That is not based on performance any longer, right? That has a lot to do. You ever heard the phrase, it's all about who you know? You ever heard that phrase?
Yep.
That is this. that is saying there's an element where it doesn't matter how smart you are. Because if the person in power doesn't know you and doesn't open a door for you, you won't get in. Okay? That's why I think the statement isn't controversial either. So once again, understanding where they're coming from and understanding where you agree with them is important. Okay, now where does race come in? Any questions before I go into like what we came here for tonight? We good? We're letting the burrito sit? Okay, let's keep going. William Wilberforce, standing in front of Parliament, 1789. As soon as ever I have arrived thus far in my investigation of the slave trade, I confess to you, sir, so enormous, so dreadful, so irremediable did its wickedness appear that on my mind was completely made up for the abolition. Dr. King's in Birmingham jail, you deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstration. I am sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. What's interesting to me is that if you took out Birmingham and changed the year to 2020, that statement could still apply to last year and the year before and the year before. So to me, where we're going now is what happens. So remember, I wanted to show you the intellectual history and the sociology of knowledge. I'm now going to go more the sociology of knowledge. I showed you how the theory evolved intellectually, right? That we started at access and truth, identity, and liberation, and how over time it's evolved into other things, right? But now I'm going to show you the events in human history that led us to critical race theory. Super, super quick. More text. I'm super, super sorry. We'll start with the yellow stuff. Slavery in the United States started in the 1600s, right? First arrival in the United States was 1619, okay? I'll just paraphrase this. As the slave populations became more dense, after the states declared independence in 1776, a number of laws were passed to further extinguish any hope for freedom for Blacks or anyone of African American origin. For example, there were hereditary slave laws that made children of enslaved mothers slaves for life. So if your mother was a slave in the United States in 1776, they told you you would also be a slave for life. There were laws that prohibited marriages between whites and non-whites. If you try, like my wife is not Black American, my wife was born in Russia. It would have been illegal for my wife to marry me in 1776. She would have gone to jail. I would have not been alive. Laws restricting the education of slaves, as education often led to a stronger desire for freedom and insurrection. Laws pertaining to harsh penalties to any slave owners who desired to free their slaves. And then, have you heard of the Naturalization Act of 1790? Yes, okay. It denied citizenship to anyone who was not a free white citizen. So if you were anything other than that, the Naturalization Act said you cannot be a citizen of the United States. Okay, moving forward. In immediately after the ratification of the 13th Amendment. So we're in 1865. We started in 1619. We're in 1865. At the beginning of the Reconstruction, many Southern states began to enact a series of what are known as the Black Codes. Have you heard of the Black Codes? So the Black Codes went into effect in 1865. Okay, like I said, I'm just running through. As wicked as the Black Codes were, they got worse, and they turned into what was called the Jim Crow laws. Have you heard of the Jim Crow laws? Okay, Jim Crow laws took place. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Hopefully you've heard of that court case. It affirmed the separate but equal facilities, which as soon as that went into law in 1896, that started 70 years of Jim Crow, okay? 70 years of laws that pretended equality in the context of racial segregation. In fact, in truth, though, they were pernicious laws that were about anything but equality, okay? Almost done. Civil rights leaders, Dorothy Heights, John Lewis, things like the Civil Rights Act of 19, so look at the year on that. Now we're at 1964. So we started in 1691, 1964. Voting Rights Act of 1965 are what ended Jim Crow on the books, right? So on the books, 1965, that's when it ended. 1965 was 57 years ago. Does that make sense? My wife's parents are much older than 57. And so I've had great conversations with them about this evolution. But 57 years ago is when 70 years of the most oppressive laws on the books for separate equal came off the books. Okay. But if you go from 1619 to 1965, how many years is that? More than 300, right? It's a long time.
165.
Right. So it was a long time. Okay. So that is the sociology of knowledge that gave birth in the United States to the ideology of critical race theory. Are you all with me? Does that make sense? Okay, so it should be obvious. Now, I said 346 because when I was drafting this, I wasn't using 1619, I was using a different date. It should be obvious to all of us that 365 years of an exclusion from constitutional rights, Black codes, and Jim Crow would severely impede, if not destroy, a people group, right? Does that make sense? Right? It's a long time to have that kind of things, those kind of things happen. Let's keep moving. One key focus of critical race theory is a regime of white supremacy and white privilege maintained despite the rule of law and despite the constitutional guarantee of equal protection of laws. That's where that came from. Right? So now you know where the intellectual history came from. I showed you the Frankfurt School. We talked about the evolution of that idea. And there's more there about how critical theory turned into critical race theory. But now you also know that on the books, why predominantly scholars of color in Ivy League schools, critical race theory was born at Harvard. The reason why Ivy League scholars of color begin to be very, very critical of law and culture when this first started to become popularized was because of the context that I just showed you. After doing research, they said, now hang on, even though we've made some progress, we've made progress against like Jim Crow, but there's a ton of other things on the books that are still very much in force that have not been dealt with. Does that make sense? Right? So a lot of where it started was like in law and like in courtrooms. That's where a lot of this started. If you look into like a lot of the original voices, a lot of this was like Ivy League voices in courtrooms. Obviously, it's evolved since then. Okay, I promise that's the last, second to last, small text slide. But the next one's not for a long time. Okay, how are we doing? How are we feeling? Are we still alive? You guys still with me? We're still doing okay? Okay. So how do we respond to this? Right? How do we respond? Critical race theorists work to change laws and culture in an effort to create an anti-racist nation, right? Anti-racist in the sense that a non-racist nation, in their estimation, cannot happen passively. It can't be something that's like, oh, well, let's just try to be okay and we'll arrive at a non-racist agenda. They're saying, no, in order to get away from all forms of racism, we have to look at racism and fight back against it in the same way that Wilberforce did or that Dr. King did, okay? My approach to achieve this goal is multifaceted. And now I'm going to get into how I do this. Okay, before I go into this, is there any questions, comments, concerns about what I just shared? Go ahead.
I guess you said, I'm not sure if you said this is also going to talk about after the talk, but like, okay, the intellectual history, is this access to truth that you were talking about? Is it, insofar as epistemologically concerned, is it a refutation of the correspondence theory of truth in favor of a more socially constructed truth? How does that work?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say that it claims that if a person has achieved a certain level of power, that they would no longer accurately correspond to truth, epistemologically, that they would begin to proliferate a lot of erroneous decision making based off of unsubstantiated biases, is what that's claiming. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's what that's claiming. So that is not proposing some kind of new epistemological framework. That is saying, if I give you $1 trillion tomorrow, your relationship with logic will change, probably for the worse. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
So are you claiming that there's like active forces in this country that continue to hold minority population down? Because I can completely agree with generational poverty as being a very influential factor that is difficult to get past for a lot of populations. But I just can't see any like active policies that need to be changed in order to, fix any kind of systematic racism.
So what you've done is you've advanced the conversation in a predictable way, right? Because that's where the conversation goes, right? Is people say, okay, well, how does that apply to now, right? Because I think now is kind of okay. I'm still getting there, to be fair. And two, I don't claim to be a law expert. That's not my thing. What I will say in response to what you asked, briefly though, is it would appear to me, based off of what I shared with you, that if we were to examine the law books as they related to education, healthcare, and various things, I actually will present to you a case study here in a moment that comes from actually the housing market. That was data released by the housing sector that showed discrimination. I would not be surprised to find things that are still on the books that would be problematic. Now, that being said, your real question was, do I think there are people who are out to oppress other people? I'm going to choose to answer your question this way. I'm going to choose to answer your question in line with what I've shared so far and not with stuff I haven't shared yet, okay?
Well, there's always going to be individual case studies. I mean, if we were to alleviate racism in the minds of every single individual person, that would be very, very difficult. I think only God can manage that.
True. For the sake of staying within the realms of what I presented, I'll offer you something in line with what critical theory proposes. Remind me of your first name. Ethan. Critical theory suggests that if you were to work very hard, you're a sophomore in psychology. If you were to work incredibly hard over the next 10 years and find yourself as one of the most prominent voices in the field of psychology, prominent, to where you were given your own practice, they were naming theorems after you, that you would find yourself as an incredibly powerful person. And that you would think that you had earned that. I worked hard, I did certain things. And you would see challenges to your power as an affront, as something to be resisted, okay? And you may have at that point established certain relationships that allows you to effectively protect your position. Let's say another psychologist is on the rise and threatens some of your prominence. You might have a relationship to where you're able to impact that person's success in some way. And in your mind, maybe it's not unethical. Maybe you're just like, that's a competitor. It's kind of a shark world, and I'm kind of the bigger fish, right? According to critical theory, what you've done there satisfies the question that you asked me, which is you've oppressed another person in a way that contextually is unfair because of your access to certain resources.
I just don't think that's so clearly related to race.
The way that I'm going to get into in a moment is that and as I showed you before, the word that I showed you at the bottom of Jim Crow was the word pernicious. Now, obviously, from what I showed, I don't think you and I would disagree that the things that were taking place during the 1860s and the 1960s, some of those were obviously very, very intentional. In my lifetime, I've met people who have shared with me the things that their grandparents taught them growing up about Black people. So it'd be hard for us to sit here and try to assess the mental state and backgrounds of everyone, right? But I do think that on the basis of the neutral example that I just gave you, we could see examples of where that could happen as it relates to race. And then if we allow ourselves a continuum of people who are more well-meaning and people who are less well-meaning and who came from backgrounds that were intentionally, I had people look me in my face several generations older than me and said, growing up, I was taught to think this way about a person that looked like you, right? If we allow people to kind of inhabit this continuum, I think it's very plausible that you can have people with great access to resources who might find themselves in a position of cutting off others for very superficial reasons. I don't think that violates what I shared so far, and hopefully you find that as a rational assessment.
Do you think that can, like, I don't want to, I'm just going to say, do you think that can be applied the other way? Do you think that judging people based on the fact that they are white defined as racism as well?
Oh, absolutely. Racism is an unsubstantiated judgment based on something that's superficial, right? So that's why when I asked the question, should racism be abolished? I didn't say should the oppression of Black people by white people should be abolished. I asked if racism should be abolished, and that word denotes something that is transcultural and trans. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we're agreed on that racism as a whole. But those are really good questions. I saw a hand back here. Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I understood accessibility for truth.
Right.
As far as I understand, it's more dealing with the idea that sufficiently large systems tend to preserve only their own existence.
Which is, I mean, natural. I don't know if you disagree with that, but I mean, Amazon isn't just giving away market shares, right? Like they.
As far as I know, it's more in line with that idea. Perhaps.
Yes. I would say that that's a great way for someone with no philosophical training to present it. I would say for those that consider themselves deeper thinkers, it does bleed into epistemology in the sense that your ability to make logical inferences changes with how powerful you become, because you kind of are making it based on new parameters. And so some of your decisions can be based off of, oh, I need to protect these parameters more so than just for the sake of maybe what's right, or maybe for the sake of maybe a different set of parameters you would have considered had maybe not having that access. And I think one interesting study is like lottery winners, right? I think lottery winners is a very interesting case study, right? A lot of them seem to make very erroneous judgments all of a sudden just because they have this windfall, right? And they find themselves
They're buying lottery.
true, right? Or the same can be said for professional athletes, right? People who were seemingly, quote unquote normal, whatever that means, people, and all of a sudden, they make all these very strange decisions when you have a big check.
Do you think power corrupts absolutely?
If you're asking my personal opinion, I think it would be more dangerous to win $1 billion than to become president, because I believe that normalcy or social conventions restrict us in a way, but I think they can oppress our peaks and our valleys. Like, you're not really allowed to express who you are because you have to go to school and you have to go to work, you know what I mean? So you kind of have to blend in. But if you're allowed to just be yourself all day because you have like $1 trillion, who you are will become magnified because there's nothing keeping you in any kind of social norm. So if you're a person who's really addicted to, say, gambling, you no longer have to like sneak it in on the weekends after you've worked a double and you've earned 20 extra bucks. You can just go buy a casino and build it in your backyard, you know what I mean? And now your whole life is kind of magnified. Does that make sense? So your moral principles are on display, but I think your vices.
Well, theoretically.
Well, I mean, I think I follow where he's coming from a little bit, though. A lot of our political structure can be influenced by the almighty dollar a little bit. So
No, that's been in recent years
Yeah, so I would say that the reason why money corrupts is because it releases you from the social chains of normalcy, and you can just show us who you are, right? If you like surfing, you build a tidal wave pool in your backyard, and you know what I mean. So I think you follow me there. Okay, let's keep moving. Good question. Case for validity of lived experience. One of the challenges that happened when we shared the history, Black American history as it relates to slavery, your history as it relates to the gospel, whatever it is a lot of times lived experience can lose validity in certain circles. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but you share something that happened during the Holocaust, or you share something that happened to your grandfather, something that happened to you, and some people can say, oh, well, that's really sad that happened to you, but that doesn't have any bearing on the conversation. Have you ever experienced that before in a conversation? Where like, oh yeah, I know that we had slaves at one point, but that doesn't have any bearing on today. Richard Swinburne and Kaiman Kwan, because this, for example, where this came up is this happened a lot in religious conversations. People would say, oh, well, I know there's a God because I meet God. God speaks to me and does things with me. And people who don't believe in God would say, oh, that's nice that you have these experiences, but that isn't veridical. Like, that's not evidence for anything. That's just you and your mind, right? And Swinburne disagrees. They disagree largely on what's called the principle of credulity. So if it seems epistemically to me that X is present on the basis of experience, and hopefully there's not something left off, I don't think there is, then probably X is present unless there are special considerations to the contrary. What is this doing? What is Swinburne doing? Swinburne moves experience in its original sense in the literature, he's talking about religious experience, but he moves experience into the same place that another form of experience was already properly based in philosophical textbooks, and that is sense experience. There's very little argument against sense experience being properly based. What do I mean by that? It is unusual to doubt your senses. Does that make sense? Like, that's unusual. It'd be unusual to think you're hallucinating right now, right? But how do you justify? This is very interesting. I found this very interesting. This is the conversation I took there. How do you justify the validity of your sense experience?
Are you talking about like Descartes, I think, therefore I am?
Close. But typically you say, oh, I can trust my senses based off of what? Your memory, right? Oh, because, in the last 10 years, if it smells like pizza, it's usually a pizza, right? Like, it's, tables are usually tables. But it's interesting in the literature, and I'm not going to get deep into this because I will get lost on a rabbit trail. But it's interesting that your memory is susceptible to the same objectives of not just your sense experience, not just religious experience, but many other types of experience. And so as Swinburne began to push this, and as you guys know, he's considered probably one of the greatest living philosophers of religion, maybe ever, but definitely of our lifetime. As he began to push this in the literature with more and more rigor, people actually began to take it very, very seriously. So he argues that it is a fundamental principle of rationality apart from which we cannot provide a non-circular justification of either perception or memory. It would be very challenging for you to provide a non-circular justification for your memory. Very challenging for you to do that without including something from your memory. For you to defend why you trust your memory without using your memory, I would pay you. It would be very difficult to do, okay? But on that basis, he says there's something there. He goes on and says this, and I'll tie this back to race in a moment. If you see PC, it's that, okay? But he says it has to be used with other principles. It's a framework. For example, you have to use what's known as the principle of testimony. That's something else in philosophy. Other things being equal, other experiences likely to be as they report them to be. There's something else, the principle of simplicity. I'm sure you guys have heard of this, often raised, right? In a given field, we take most likely to be true, the simplest theory. The principle of charity. Maybe you've never heard of this theory in philosophy. Other things being equal, we suppose other men are like ourselves. I don't know if you ever know that's actually a theory in philosophy. We suppose other men are like ourselves. So I told you that this approach is going to be very unusual because typically, if I just share with a room the history of Black American slavery in the United States, the response, if anyone shares it, if anyone hears it, the response has a variety of responses. But typically, a question like you asked earlier about like, okay, well, how does that apply to today comes up at some point, right? And people say, okay, well, yeah, that was horrible. What does that got to do with me? Well, what I propose it has to do with you is there's something to be said about about experience that has weight on our theories. On our theories. Look at why I shifted that to, on our theories. If we take PC alone, it may look unduly egocentric. However, Swinburne shows us something different, that it's equally empathetic on trusting others and the social dimension of knowing. His approach has to be distinguished from an anything goes approach, however. It's not just like, oh, well, you know, I experienced a unicorn behind my house. You know what I mean? And so
A man once said he met God after an LSD trip.
You said what?
A man once told me that he met God after an LSD trip and that he was a mountain.
And it is right. There are parameters to this thing, though, right? It's recognized that initial epistemic seemings are fallible, especially if it's LSD involved, right? So the hope lies in the ability to sift and correct this initial data. How does it apply? I'm going to show you. For example, erroneous epistemic seemings can be corrected by other epistemic seemings, which is why things like the principle of testimony is very, very important, right? Because if you say that I came in this room last night and lit the whole place on fire, and everyone else disagrees with you, right? That will correct your incorrect data. So how does that apply to what we are talking about? There are basically two approaches. This is called the argument from avoiding skepticism that Swinburne and his student proposed. There are basic, you're gonna have a lot of questions, but we don't have time for that. There are basically two approaches to our experiences: initial doubt or initial trust. I'm going to show you how this applies to racial stone. Initial doubt, initial trust. Initial doubt would lead to skepticism. Initial trust would avoid skepticism. Epistemological approaches would lead to skepticism. It's not acceptable. Therefore, initial doubt is not acceptable, but initial trust is acceptable. I've got like 90 more slides from the professor on this that I could like point you to, and like tons of readings. So I'm just going to leave this here, allow you to like maybe not be happy with that. But I'm just going to show you that here and say, just for tonight, we have to keep going. Has anyone ever seen this before or heard of this before? The argument for avoiding skepticism? Is that new for, have you heard of this before?
I think I've made similar points because I encountered things like Hume's uncertainty principle or Hume's problem with induction, for example, where he's trying to question, the very foundation of knowledge. And I would say, if you're questioning the foundation of knowledge, then we can't have discussion.
Exactly.
A similar idea.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, good. Quick case study, and then I want to land this point. But first, I want to just like take a pause, take a breath, partially because I'm hot, but also because I want to like recenter where we're going. What have we done so far? When you came in here and you heard race theory, you probably thought lots of things. What you've experienced so far is we've talked about the intellectual history of race theory, right? Where it started and how the theory itself evolved. Then we talked about how in the United States, these terms, white privilege, all these systematic racism terms, all those different things, I set those to the side and I took you for a 365-year walk, right? Down the lines of what has happened in this country. And then I showed you how at the back of those two parallel lines, how they intersected and critical race theory was born. Why did I just show you PC, principle of credulity? Is because PC says on the basis of lived experience, we should not move it to the side and say, okay, well, that happened, but that has no bearing on today. That could potentially violate how we even approach things like Christian scriptures, right? Because we wouldn't say, oh, well, that happened then, that has no bearing on today. That's not how we talk. We say, no, this religion has been building over time. And it's something valuable we can gain from looking backwards. That's all we're doing here. Does that make sense? You guys with me so far? Okay. Let's come to the present day. This was in a book called Introduction to Economics. What's so interesting about this book is that it was in my master's program, and I didn't realize there was a case study on racism. So I was like, I'm gonna add this to my notes. So most people buy their home with the help of a mortgage, unless you're super, super rich. In contrast, they began to compare how many people were denied in the early 90s, 20% of Black applicants compared to 90% of white applicants. As they did this study, the Boston Fed, which was the institution that produced this data, were the ones that began to conclude that there actually is a bias. As a data scientist, my job is to build models, Bayesian algorithms for weather, heuristics to build natural language processing algorithms. And what's very, very interesting is that those algorithms can gain biases based on the data, right? So if my data is heavily biased, my algorithm will be biased. I could build a racist algorithm if I wanted to. I just have to feed it racist data, right? Like it would be impartial. So they concluded that there was a bias in the mortgage market based off of their findings. And if you wanted to see the difference between 28.9%, just add a number to it, right? Like 3,000, and you'll see it's actually a very big gap. Okay, so we've identified that there is something that has happened. We should give it heed, and that there are still many, many cases, that's just one, where we could prove mathematically, not even like anecdotally, that there are disparities in the system. What should we do? What should we do? What should we do? What I propose that we do is ask ourselves this question. I actually want to hear your response to this. This has been my approach to race theory. This is, and we're getting ready to land the plane. I don't know how much longer I have. It's 8 o'clock.
We usually get it to 9.
Okay. Well, no, that's good. So for me, this has been my approach. So the first half has all been history stuff, Rich, which is not, I don't think it's controversial, but it's history stuff. But now this is the question that caused this university to tell me you cannot talk to it. Was this question? It was this question. It was this question. So when Noah said, "Hey, I always talk to CSU about this question," I was like, laugh. Have you heard the question? Not everyone likes the question. But this is the question that I propose. Based off of everything we said, this is where I think the answer lies. This is where I think the crossroad lies. What are your thoughts on this question? Go ahead, sir.
I agree with it. I mean, yes, I think there is a right and a wrong way to think about race.
Okay.
So I propose the question is currently on the projector.
Yeah.
Is there other? I mean, yes, obviously, we should aim to not be racist and whatnot, but insofar as I think when dealing with race, we ought to consider a multifaceted approach, avoid causal oversimplification. And insofar, I think we ought to avoid relying too much on, I guess this is more from an epistemic foundation, rely on less on critical epistemology and rely more on, I guess, I'm not sure if we call it modernist or enlightenment, but traditional rationality, but while still taking a multifaceted approach that deals with the human side of things, but without, embracing the critical epistemology.
Yeah, so I got 2 people who agree with my question, but would you be surprised at the people who vehemently disagree with this question? No. Just deeply disagree with this question, right? They say, oh, there's no wrong way. We live in a culture, right, where wrong is not really a viable term to people, right? They're like, no, there's no such thing as wrong. There's just your way versus my way. Have you guys run into this yet? Right? Yeah. This is what's breaking down our society. Because that's not how things work, right? Like there's like 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5 because you want it to, right? It doesn't equal 5 because it doesn't equal 5. It equals 4. And so I apply that strict of a standard to this. That's where the question becomes very, very challenging. But for me, right, before we ask if there's a right way to think about right and wrong as a concept applied to race, we have to see if there's right and wrong. This is a concept in general. This is an argument that I put together to support that. I want to see what you guys think of this argument. Premise number 1. It's an offshoot of the moral argument, so you recognize some of the premises, but it's doubled in size. Premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, conclusion 1, conclusion 2, conclusion 3. What are your thoughts? Yes.
I see a modus unintended and modus tollens.
Any more thoughts? Someone disagree with it? Go ahead.
I don't know that the first premise is necessarily productive, but I agree with it.
What part of the first premise do you find controversial?
I think that it's possible that objective morality is not rooted in the divine being. I don't think it's logically impossible. So I don't know that I necessarily follow the conclusion.
Okay. How do you define objective?
Personally, I believe that objective morality is rooted in God.
have to.
How do you define objective?
I personally define objective as outside of myself. So like, if it was subjective, it would be me defining morality. Objective would be some other principle, or in this case, God defining morality.
Right, typically we say separate from human opinion. Right, objective would be, if I say gray sweaters are the best jackets in the world, right? The preference is in the subject, me, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other subjects, right? But if we were to say that, you know, if you travel to the sun, you're going to be incinerated, right? The preference is not in the subject. The preference is in the object, because that's just an observation.
Not with that attitude.
Not with that attitude, you won't, you quitter. But the thing about it is, as it applies especially to morality, would you be able to propose another grounding for morality?
I don't know that I'm smart enough.
As many of you know, Sam Harris probably got the furthest. You guys know who that is? When he proposed that science is not just good for facts, but also good for value statements. He uses the analogy of when someone says, you go to the doctor says you should be healthy. He proposes that it's a very ambiguous term, right? What does healthy mean? He says 150 years ago, it meant living to the age of 40. Now it means not being in excruciating pain. That's kind of a definition of healthy. And in Sam Harris's mind, in his literature, he proposes that no one questions the philosophical underpinnings of medicine when doctors tell you that you should be healthy. No one says, well, I want to be throwing up all the time. Who are you to tell me that I shouldn't be in excruciating pain? So on his mind, he sees morality as something that has evolved over time. He says things like marital preference and not cheating on your spouse was something that, you know, animals saw was beneficial, that we just gave laws to when we got better at using words. So he's, I think, gotten the furthest, but he's been accused of what we call moral semantics, where he confuses the moral ontology of what we're actually talking about. We're talking about how do you ground moral principles, and actually of using words equivocally, saying the word good, but using non-moral terms when he says it. Yes, go ahead.
I found, if you're gonna go for a non-theistic approach, I tend to define Weilenberg's approach.
Eric Wallenberg's,
Yeah.
and what is it, robust?
It's
What's his book called? Isn't it called like Robust Ethics? I thought I read it. Remind me again how he defends his theory.
It's pretty much what is moral is rooted in, he's just a Platonist, it's rooted in the forms, right? The forms are existent abstract objects that root objectively ground morality as such. It's not really, actually.
I mean, I'd have to hear that defended more.
Well, so Dr. Craig and Eric Weilenberg had a debate, right? And I actually thought Dr. Craig didn't really answer Dr. Weilenberg's claims beyond so much. It got to theism is more probable or more defendable or like a better explanation than Platonism, right? So essentially it got to, okay, your theory works if Platonism is true, but now you have to defend Platonism, right? And so that's what I did. But if you could defend Platonism as a theory of ontology and stuff like that, then I think you have that kind of objective morality grounding.
I guess my issue with that is I would consider Van Inwagen maybe a better Platonist. And when I was in New York, I actually came to listen to Dr. Craig talk to Van Inwagen. Actually, Van Inwagen and Dr. Greg Welty were both critiquing Dr. Craig's theory of divine aseity. And we got deep into Platonic ideals. And I suppose where I found it not convincing was he says, even if you were to move Platonic ideals to these eternal place, like make love this coexisting thing with your idea of God, how would it impose something on us?
Oh, sure.
Because abstract objects by definition are non-causal, right? So how would this thing all of a sudden like make me abide by its identity? I guess I struggle to find that convincing. Go ahead, sir.
I would say it is like I don't see any problems with this, but the idea of like saying it's God, as in with the Christian God, might be where it might be the solution. So it doesn't necessarily have to follow a Christian kind of theistic God for that to work. You could have any kind of what you might call objective God besides that. And then you would have the same conclusion, but you would end up with a different right or wrong.
To your point, I didn't specify the word God can be ambiguous in this argument, but in the sense that it's being used, especially in reference to the word objective, we're really referring to the nature of reality, and we're saying that's kind of the only thing necessarily existing enough to ground space, time, and matter, and thus morality. But to your point, then we'd have to do more work to specify which God we're talking about. So
I don't know, I don't think wrangle a paganistic, like, many gods of all varying sorts and sizes out of.
Maybe not, but you could definitely take like the Islamic God, right?
Yeah,
So,
I mean, like, it works very well. with the
but I
single-
guess I was gonna point out that
That's not trying
as-
to argue that.
yeah, as far as it, as
Define spaghetti monster, and then you have a very, very good.
you would, but this argument doesn't argue for what right or wrong is, like what the content there is. It's just that they are objectively based and that they exist, right?
Maybe I have to go like 1.5.
And my next argument gets more specific into that one. So we're going there. Okay. So we've agreed on there's a such thing as right and wrong. Once again, when I present this, if someone comes to me and says right and wrong doesn't exist, we come here and we dance. I've done some door-to-door evangelism. Went to a house in Fort Collins with a pastor from Ghana. I've been a pastor for 25 years. First door we hit was an atheist. Knock on the door. I don't know how many of you have done door-to-door evangelism. I've done it for many years. Apartment complexes, chased by dogs, the whole nine. It's all very fun. We knock on the door. The guy opens the door. Pastor starts up in on the gospel. Guy's like in his flip-flops. Guy's like, my quiche is burning. I gotta go. Like, I don't care. And so the pastor looks at me and he says, John, you deal with it. And then just leaves me, just walks off, right? And so I'm like, okay. So I, in a way, essentially just had this conversation with the guy. I said, you strike me as an intellectual. Let's talk about this. An hour later, we're still talking. We made it to like here. And he was just like, refuse. I mean, we were just dancing because he was like, well, no, he refused my conclusion, but he couldn't defeat any of the premises. So by the time we got to the end, I showed him like, you are obligated to accept the conclusion if you can't show me a defeater to the premise. And by the end, he actually allowed me to share the gospel with him. And then he said, you can come back whenever you want. So whenever people wrestle with, if there's a such thing as right and wrong objectively, we dance around this and have a great conversation. But then we go, is there a right and wrong way to think? What say ye? You could just.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, it depends on what object we're thinking about. If we're thinking about propositions, logical propositions, absolutely, there is a right and a wrong way to evaluate these propositions. But if it's just like, do I like this ice cream or not? It's no.
If it's not chocolate mint, you're wrong. No, it's so to your point, you know, I like how you made the differentiation because right, like the imagination might be kind of a different round. But as it relates to most conversations, right, there's a wrong way to think, right? Because thinking involves assessing arguments, right? When it comes to engagement with other people, right? Deductive versus inductive. So logical fallacies are the presidential debate, right? Like if you watch most conversations in politics, it's just like a study in fallacies, right? Like it's just like one after the other. It's amazing, actually. So you guys know what logical fallacies are, and they're formal violations of logic. So you guys know what a self-referential incoherence is, a statement that can't even stand up to the weight of its own criteria. So I'm going to just rush through this. You guys know what truth is. I give this in circles where not everyone agrees with these things, so usually I slow down. But in a circle that's like named reason for Christ, usually people have heard more than once. Self-referential incoherence. You guys all good on that? Definition of truth. That's what I figured. So
I have a question about the first one. You said.
which one? Where do you want me to go back?
Yes, that one.
This one?
That which corresponds matches equal to its object.
Yes.
Are you, when you say object, are you referring to an obtaining state of affairs or just to the laws of logic themselves?
Well, I tried to highlight laws of logic on there because, that whole thing about correspondence and identity and, like if he can't be him and you at the same time in the same place
Right.
is more of where I'm going with that. Good question. Unless you're Chuck Norris. We know that to one of your earlier questions about correspondence, this is how we can correspond to truth, and one of the gateways we can walk through to kind of ground it. So we've identified there's a right and wrong way to think about thinking, but what about race? What is race? Well, the denotation of the word is this. Right? Race is a family, tribe, people, or nation belonging to the same stock. Technically, if the Bible is correct, we're all the same race. A class or kind of people unified by same interests, habits, or characteristics. So you can see by the definition that yes, skin color provides a class or kind of unification for people who share in its features, but if you truly consider all the overlap, it would really not make sense. And let me just say this. I get so frustrated. This is where I get really, really frustrated. As a business owner, I think there's nothing more silly, and as a former athlete, I think there's nothing more silly than passing up talent for a strange reason that is superficial. Like if you come to me and you're amazing at what you do, but I don't choose you because I'd rather choose this other person because they look different. To me, that's just bad business. You know what I mean? Like that's not even like, that's just like unwise. Like if you own a baseball team and this guy's literally the best hitter you've ever seen, but he's the wrong color and you don't choose him, to me, that's just odd. I just have never understood that. Okay, so what is the right way to view race? I invite you guys to try to answer this question separate from your religious ties. What would be the right way to view race based off of what I shared so far? So I'm going to move you to 1865. I'm going to move you to Supreme Court room, and you're sitting in a country that is just came out of 365 years. Your parents are probably alive somewhere. Your parents are probably teenagers somewhere, young kids somewhere, depending on how old your parents are. You may have been alive 57 years ago. So I'm going to move you to the Supreme Court room, and you're sitting in front of a panel of people. I can move you back further to like 1780, to where slavery is making more money for Britain than the military is. And your goal is to explain to them. It's amazing what Wilberforce accomplished. I mean, Wilberforce was asking them to change like how their country worked at such a foundational level. And he knew that, which is why it took him so long to win. And they're asking you, okay, sir, how should we view race? How should we view race?
Immutable characteristic that the person in question has no control.
I did. Funny enough, that actually causes a lot of issue with intersectionality. Do you guys know what intersectionality is? Because, do you guys know why? Can anybody guess where I'm going with this comment? Where do you think I'm going with this comment?
Intersectionality views someone is more oppressed if they belong to more minority statuses, whether they be sexual orientation, race, gender, etc. The more groups that are oppressed that you belong to, the more, I guess, status you have for, not status, but how do I say this? The more warrants you are given within critical theory, at least as in modern.
Oh, yes. I love that, what you did there. Because you now know that most people don't handle critical theory well. But that is what intersectionality is commonly known as. Where I was going to build off of what you said is you can get some infighting between those oppressed groups, because many of them will claim, oh, well, I've had people come to me and say, hey, you guys had it rough in this country for a long time. And so you should understand why we too are fighting for our rights. And I will say things like, especially if it's like, related to something that's not immutable, like a behavior choice. And I will say, well, no, because that's a behavior. And this is something that, like, there's never been someone who was born with this characteristic and didn't also die with that characteristic versus a choice. You can, it could be a difficult choice, but it's still a choice. A lot of sexual orientations are behavior patterns, they're not immutable characteristics. So you can actually see that cause problems. That was a rabbit trail. Okay, so this argument is the only other slide that used to have small print. I think my wife fixed it on the way over here, so that's good. But this argument answers your question about which God we're talking about. So when people ask me, if people concede to every part of my presentation so far and say, great, I get the intellectual history, great, I get the sociology of knowledge, great, I get that it's still happening, you could probably show me 100 case studies, and I could. And aside from personal experience, great, you could show me how, there are these principle of credulity, and we should give more heediness to people's backgrounds, great. I concede to this argument for sacred personhood. But as far as the way forward, what do you propose in light of all that? And here's what I suggest. Premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, premise 4, conclusion.
You're saying that scripture itself provides our basis to navigate the issues of race we face in this country.
Technically, I said the worldview taught in the canonical and venerated sacred scripture texts that were written thousands of years ago in the land of Israel. But yes, that's how most people understand it. But I don't say scripture because I try to be as specific as possible. And there's many ways you can get lost when you say scripture, depending on who you're talking to.
I guess your second, I don't know. point- not premise, but your second
This
point.
one?
No, in your fourth premise, it's one of the second points, the context of defined Chicago statement. Will it potentially exclude other Christian traditions, which to me is problematic?
Who knows about the Chicago Statement? Who's never heard of the Chicago Statement? Show me. Okay. For those of you who have, who wants to take a stab at explaining what that is? Okay, I'll do it. So there was an endeavor, a commission, that said, what if we got 98 scholars and 2 pastors into a room from all biblical translations and denominations and had them release an official statement on scripture, trying to assess how much of this they were going for 2 things, infallibility and inerrancy. Do we know what those words mean? Who can explain inerrancy? Who can explain infallibility?
Can't have it.
Right, so they were trying to, because how many times have you heard people say there are errors in scripture? Have you heard people say that? So they were trying to put an end to that conversation. So they brought 100 people together. I please don't believe what I'm saying. Go look it up for yourself. And they asked them to release a final statement across all these disciplines. Is there an error in scripture? And they released what is known as the Chicago Statement. The Chicago Statement is where I believe the most precise language around biblical context. I don't believe when you read scripture tells you how to define it across all cultures. Does that make sense? Like, I think the scripture just tells you like what happened. It's just like events happening in scripture that you read. You just like, this is what I did. This is my interaction with this. But this statement, I believe, was one of the most definitive. It was kind of a response. It was called the Manhattan Statement, which I think was a little less convincing. But I consider it, by my estimations, one of the most precise articulations of how you should view inerrancy and infallibility ever. And I think those 100 people did a really good job. So to your point, Could it exclude some people? Potentially, but I think they tried to be very ecumenical in their approach, and they tried to honor all disciplines. So if you've never read the Chicago Statement, I encourage you to read it tonight. Any more thoughts on what I've put up in front of you? How do you think this would sit in, let's say, a completely atheistic
Very
group?
poorly,
Why?
because it's.
Like, which point do you think they would argue with me the strongest?
Well, they would probably argue with the fourth one. Probably just off of the basis of it's stating a thing that is not fully accepted by most people.
Which part of it?
But they would probably say that it's not the only worldview that is supported across the.
So remember, it says that this specific, and what's interesting is that the way I've defined the text applies to several groups. And not even just religions, but the Chicago Statement narrows it down, obviously. But described reality in the way that I described, that's not controversial. And the only worldview part, to your point, that is supported across disciplines. Now, to your point, they would obviously kick off. And I would say we would get into a lot of conversation at that point about cosmology and morality and mathematics, and it'd be kind of a whole thing. But yes, that is where I would lose people for sure. Anything else? Any other thoughts about how this would be taken?
So when you're defining how to properly navigate reality, are you talking about aligning with the objective moral truths? How are you defining properly navigate reality?
So remember how I defined reality in point one.
That's what.
Yeah. So point one is where I gave you how I defined reality. And so by the conclusion, to your point earlier, like which God are we talking about? This is where I like narrow that down, especially if you've already conceded to my last argument. Does that make sense? Like if you've already conceded that personhood is sacred on the basis of God, now I'm becoming more specific. I think I would find this convincing. To me, this is convincing epistemic. Like this isn't dogmatically convincing to me. This is epistemically convincing to me. Like go ahead.
What about like literal contradictions? Well, I guess contradictions within certain literal interpretations of the text, or just different interpretations of the text that produce contradictions.
Have you read the Chicago Statement?
No.
So I would just
I'm talking about the biblical text.
that's what the Chicago Statement is about. Is your exact question. Is what the whole mission behind the Chicago Statement.
Okay, so I haven't read it, so
Yeah, I would just encourage you to like just if you guys have never read it, I would encourage you to never have a conversation again about Bible errors until you at least see it. Like just glance over it once before you hit that again. Just because they tried to bring in the best in the world to try to put that conversation to bed. That's all it was. Okay. So that's why I included it. That's my response to that question.
sorry I asked.
No. It's a good question. It's a good question. I just wanted to. That's just why I put that in. Okay, we're almost there. Woo! Man, you guys have been like working hard. So the obviously once you can see to the last point, your view of race has to align with Judeo-Christianity, right? And at that point, you walk into things like Galatians 3. You walk into things like Acts 10. You stand in front of Parliament and you rehearse scripture like Wilberforce did. You rehearse scripture to government in the 1860s like Dr. King did. That's how you get there, if on my view. And for those of us that are alive today, if you've conceded up until this point, if you have found what I've said to be sufficient, at least partially sufficient until you find a defeater on your own, which I encourage you to reach out to me if you do. The next time you're having a conversation about race, which is what I asked you in the beginning, and you disagree with someone, you're going to be more ready to accept my proposal to you about how to have that conversation go differently in the future. All of that to get here. And usually people start with this stuff. Oh, here's what I think we should do going forward. But for me, I try to lay a framework. I love this quote. Oh my gosh. I love it. I can get a tattoo of this quote on my face. Direction, not intention, determines destination. It doesn't matter what you want to have happen with racial reconciliation in your church. It does not matter what you want to have with racial reconciliation with your friends and on your campus. What matters is what you are doing. That's what matters. That determines where you end up. What matters is what you are reading. What matters is what you are saying. It does not matter that for many historians, they considered Hitler in many spaces to be very good intentioned at the beginning, right? That his intentions weren't bad. I think the same for Mao Zedong and Pol Pot. I think he was trying to save Cambodia. I think Cambodia had an issue and he was trying to save it. The fact that hundreds of millions of people starved, not hundreds, the fact that tens of millions of people starved to death was a side effect of a lack of wisdom. That was him being, and I think over time it turned into evil as he realized that and didn't stop it. But I think many of the best, I think it was Prager who said, good intentions minus wisdom equals evil. That's just what happens.
Wait, what is the quote? The path to hell is
Good.
And is the path to hell is paved with good intentions.
Good intentions are pernicious little buggers. You guys know what pernicious means? Pernicious means something that's dangerous that sneaks up on you slowly. You can't really tell. Another great way you could test this is get married. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. You know what matters? What you do. That's what matters. You can have all the best intentions in the world, but if you're not showing up to that thing and being present, it won't work. So for all intents and purposes, as it relates to race theory, it doesn't matter how good-willed you are. What matters is what we do. So what should we do? What are some barriers? On my argument, obviously there's spiritual barriers. There are forces, metaphysical, supernatural forces that do not want this country to heal, that do not want us to move forward. And notice, though I gave you the sociology of knowledge as it related to race, and that predominantly has been black and white, notice my question in the beginning was, do you want to see racism abolished? And I specify that that's raceless, right? We're just talking about, let me give you a great example. Jordan Peterson recently left the University of Toronto. Does anybody know why? Go ahead.
It was based on the idea of DI, which is diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Correct.
And it had to do with some of his grad students being marked, in a sense, with the sign of the beast because they took his class and had nowhere to go after that. So despite being well-qualified doctorate students, they could not get a job with the university or with a reasonable research program. Number one, because they were white, male, etc., and number two, because they were his students. And he said that in an effort to save, basically, incoming doctors, he is going to take himself out of the equation.
That's racist. Right? Like, if this guy is qualified, now, where I disagree with Mr. Peterson is Mr. Peterson thinks the reason why he uses the acronym DI is because he thinks diversity and inclusion is the problem. He's like, diversity and inclusion, because of BIPOCs, Black people and people of color, is causing my qualified white male students to not get jobs. And I can't stand that. My response, if anyone has a connection I can ever talk to him, I would say, well, diversity isn't the problem. Diversity denotes something that is necessary to like anything. Like, we need diversity. What the problem is that the policies that are in place that are trying to balance the workforce are not there yet. That's the problem, right? Legislation is just struggling, right?
What would correct legislation look like?
Brother, I wouldn't be here if I knew that. But that's a trickier beast, right? Because we know it's wrought with corruption. But the problem is in the legislation. The problem is not in trying to balance the workforce. Go ahead.
So let me challenge that. I see the problem as, I'll use the word spiritual, but there's a political correctness movement that appeals to the human need appeals to our pride. I feel better about myself if I am supporting this cause that's good, and since you've spoken up against it, I'm going to slap you down, and that makes me feel better about myself. We see that behavior all over the place, and it kind of becomes a vicious circle.
I'm not sure how that contradicts something I've said.
I think the legislation
is an outcome of this attitude or this philosophy that is virulent, right? It's like, oh, I've just got to hop on the bus because if I'm not, I'll get labeled as a racist myself. And then I become an advocate to show how morally righteous I am. And I see that playing out in society and across the board. People turn their brain off and they just start on being.
Sure. I think that falls under what I meant when I one of the elements of what I meant when I said that it's wrought with corruption. But yes, I feel I have a deep burden for those who are in politics. I have two convictions about politics. Number one, it saddens me how many Christians don't go into politics, because I'm like, what we need more rational thinkers. And in my assessment, based on what I showed you tonight, I see that ideology is uniquely positioned to provide stability in spaces such as that, you know? And so I have this sadness when I see people saying, well, that's kind of a zoo. I'm not gonna make a difference anyway. Because then to me, it feels like we're turning over the asylum to the inmates, and we're handing it over to people who have like no basis at all. And so then it just gets worse. But then I also have this conviction for those that are in there. Like I remember when, what was Obama's vice president's name?
Biden, the current president.
What was Trump's vice president's name?
Mike Pence.
Pence. I had an opportunity to meet Pence. I used to work at Focus on the Family as a data analyst. And Mike Pence came, he supports Focus on the Family. And so he came to Focus on the Family. And I, and I like met people who made adventures in the Odyssey, and like I, did all the finances for the international offices thing. So, they told like, hey, you want to meet the vice president? That's pretty cool. So we go downstairs and we're like stripping down, like belts coming off, people are just like throwing their phones away. And then you get there and there's like, I don't know if you've ever seen the White House Secret Service guys.
Yeah.
But they're like a different breed. Like they're not like cops are one. They got a ton of cop buddies. I love cops. My sister's a cop in the Air Force. I have great buddies that are cops. But the Secret Service guys, I don't know if they've ever been human. Like those are some mean looking boys and girls. And so we get there, but Mike Pence at one point was pretty public about his faith. I don't know if you guys remember that. And I had a burden for that. I was like, that's got to be really tough, right? Because you're in there and you have like this framework that you're kind of not allowed to follow, right? Because you're a public servant and you kind of have to like serve the people. So anyway, another rabbit hole. So these are what the barriers I see to racial reconciliation, primarily spiritual. We don't pray enough against racism of any form, whether it's happening to white men, white women, black women, Asian women, whoever it is. I don't think there's enough prayer on it. Second, emotional, intellectual. We either get too offended too fast, or we haven't thought through it critically enough. Hopefully tonight was a step in the right direction for all of us. And then on the periphery, I think are other factors. Well, hopefully we survive whatever's happening over there. So I propose an acronym as a way forward. I call it my lasso. What do people use lassos for? What are lassos used for?
Gathering cattle.
Lassos are used to pull things closer to you, right? Can you use a lasso to do anything other than pull something to you? Maybe you can anchor something to something, right? You can anchor something to a stake post. But typically, if you are holding a lasso, what are you going to do? You're going to pull something closer to where you are. So I use the acronym of the lasso. And I don't mean like in a cattle sense. Don't treat people as cattle. If you use an actual lasso, I don't know you. I didn't endorse you. But I use it as an acronym because I believe this is the way a step forward. Number one, I think listening is maybe that's what that was. Maybe it was the who can.
Oh, projector overheating.
Okay.
Oh, it's gonna blow up on the stage.
Okay.
That's hilarious.
Well, that's fine. They can still see on the Zoom, right? It's still sharing? Yeah. That's fine. I'll just stand in front of the camera and then you guys have that. Yeah, that's fine. I think this guy overheated Noah up here. This big guy, that's fine. I'm almost done. So the L refers to listening in such a way that you show the other person you heard them accurately. The next time you're in a conversation about race, your first objective, remember what I said about direction, not intention, determines destination. If your goal is to arrive at if in your heart of hearts, you're thinking like, I want to be a part of positive change in this thing, I'm going to ask you to commit to this lasso. Your goal, when they're done talking, is to show them that you heard them so well that they're like, oh my gosh, I feel like you're the first person that's like heard me on this thing. If you don't hear that, try again. Before you jump in with like, oh yeah, but this, try this. Number 2, principle of credulity, principle of experience. A lot of time we deny people's experiences. Have you guys seen this? We're like quick to be like, oh, but wasn't that bad? Like, oh, or we ask them for proof. Like, what have you been through? You guys seen this? Have you ever been, pulled over by the police? Have you ever been? Acknowledge the realities. That goes a long way, right? If anyone in here knows someone who is a survivor, one of the greatest things that helps people who have been through things is the acknowledgement that something has happened, especially in racial relations. Number 2, subpoint. Because history and its survivors record genocides on the back of racism, okay? And some of that evil still persists today in many forms. Not only are there still slaves today, but there's still many things that happen on the basis of race in many, many spaces. I was paid to come speak on race at a church, many churches, several churches. I remember at one point, one of the pastors looked at me and said, John, I need you to talk more about your pain. What he told me. I was going to do something like, not like this because of a church setting, but like similar. I was going to be more like academic with it. He was like, no, I want more of your pain. I want to hear like you've been. And you know what I told him? I said, well, that's fine because I could tell you something that happened to me as a result of being a Black man in the United States. But like when I came to Fort Collins to this school in 2010, I remember a young girl approached me and she and I were both, how old do you got to be getting college? You're like 18, right? 19? And the comment she made to me was very interesting. So me and a couple friends were out at the movies and she was like, can I take a picture with you? And I said, certainly. And then she asked to touch my hair, my face, which at that point I thought was kind of strange. And she said, you're the first Black person I've ever been this close to in my life. And so for people can all come from different spaces. But I told the pastor, I said, sir, I thought you wanted to know the way forward. Reconciliation is built on principle, not pain. I can share pain. What I shared with you obviously wasn't pain. It's just a story. I can share pain. That wasn't pain. But like for me, it's like that doesn't move us forward. Does that make sense? You see where I'm going with that? The first S. Before you engage in another conversation on race, I invite you to self-reflect on your own stances in this thing, your own irrational thoughts. What do we say about hegemony? All it does is say that your perception of truth can be warped. We are fallible creatures, right? The next S. What I mean by health is you saw on the slide before that the barriers to this conversation, they lie in spiritual, followed by emotional, intellectual, followed by physical, and then there's some peripheral ones. In my mind, if we strive to be healthy spiritually, what does that mean? If we strive to be healthy emotionally, what does that mean? Healthy physically. I think if I say be healthy physically, it's easy for you to conceptualize what I mean, right? You're like, oh, I need to eat right, sleep right. But if I tell you to be healthy spiritually, what does that mean? On the basis of the principles that I've shared tonight, I think it's clear healthy spirituality, on my view, requires a relationship with the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible. And that living out the principles I shared that showed his view on race, its view on race, to be more specific, would be you being healthy. And if your view of race differs from the scriptures that I showed, that you would thus be unhealthy spiritually as it relates to race, right? So a commitment to be healthy in all areas and to connect with resources to help you stay accountable in all areas, this is a broad stroke, but it applies to racial relations because honestly, I think when people are emotionally immature, they do damage to racial spaces of any kind, right? So let's go back to this example with Dr. Jordan Peterson. Peterson's saying something needs to change with the policies. My educated white men can't get jobs. They're qualified doctors, and we're having to create quotas for people of color who are not qualified to get jobs. We should fix this. Something's wrong with this. You know what I would assess? I would assess, I completely agree with you. We do need a solution, But I want the person who administers that solution and is the arbiter to be a very healthy person, very emotionally stable person, right? Because if we keep throwing people into the mix who come in and start off with this and they're not aware of their own triggers and biases, and they themselves are easily offended by things, the conversation continues to dissolve. Does that make sense? But if we can get people in the door that are like grounded, level-headed, able to see from multiple perspectives, have been around multiple cultures, we can go from there. And I also personally think, so I'm a guy who was raised, who came from, welfare, came from, an area of gang violence and incarcerations, came from seeing, I've had siblings die, came from all kind of stuff, living on the streets. So from my perspective, I've seen in my lifetime a transition from that to like, being in the 1% giver for my church and, being, able to pay off selling a house, doing all kind of stuff. And with that, paying for school cash, with that stuff, with that transition, it's been amazing to me how much has been overcome in that space, but how I can still walk into a space and be heavily underqualified. Heavily underqualified. Not from a lack of like effort, I assure you, but more so from just things that I've missed in my upbringing, just things that just were never shared with me, things I have to go back and learn on my own. And so I find it very interesting that there's a lack of qualified people of color in the doctor field, as Peterson asserts. I think it's a more interesting question to say, why is there a lack of? I'll ask you. I'll tell you a question or a statement I say all the time. We know in the United States that the upper echelon of all churches, so that's an absolute, not a relative statement. So I'm not saying like Baptist versus Catholic. Like if you took every church and put it on a spectrum in the United States, all public offices, all of them, you'll see why you have to do it absolutely, not relatively. And all private businesses, the upper echelons, I'm saying in like 90% or better, mathematically, are predominated by white males. The upper echelon, right? We know the percentage of white churches to black churches greatly outnumbered. We know that that you take all government offices, right, and you take like leadership positions, majority of them are headed by white men, and most businesses at the C level and up, it's typically a white male on an absolute scale, not a relative scale. So my question is, well, what does that mean in a merit-based society? What does that mean? That in a merit-based society, the people at the top are supposed to be the best. So what we're saying is 90% of the time, white males are the most qualified to run these things. Let me just land the plane. I'll be right there. So my follow-up to that is this. Nothing I've said to you so far is controversial, by the way. These are like the numbers. So my response to that is this. I say either that's true, either that's just true, and we get now. Before I finish, there's one industry that's not true at all. That is, the top of the industry is marked by all races and genders. Do you guys know which industry? Entertainment. Entertainment's the only exception. But because it's the entertainment industry, that kind of in of itself is kind of interesting. But anyway, either the white male is the most qualified to run these, think about it like drawing a number out of a hat. Like 9 out of 10 times, if it's a white male, we're gonna win. Or if you have that high of a like if you're rolling a die and 9 out of 10 times the answer is predictable, then or the system is rigged. Okay. In my mind, I'm okay with either answer. This is where I get very controversial. I'm okay if we say that white males are preoccupying these spaces because they are best. They are the most qualified. I have a follow-up question. Let's just talk about why. You know what I mean? Like let's just walk through the intellectual history and sociology of knowledge about why that's the case, right? Because regardless of where you stand on the issue, like I said, I think it could be a fairly interesting discussion. Go ahead, sir. You had your hand.
Yeah, just kind of to address the end of the question, I'm assuming you mean it like not just that it's like white men disproportionately envious, because they are like a majority in terms of like this workforce. I'm assuming that means it's like disproportionately skewed that way, even in proportion like that industry, right?
Exactly. So you what you did was very advanced, and I appreciate that. I'm talking absolutely, but even if you looked relatively to an industry, if you look at all the people who applied and the different things, you can see that there's a heavy disproportion that, and I mean, I've been in rooms listening to senior pastors, CEOs. I've sat there in meetings as they've tried to explain to hundreds of people why for the last 30 years, and they've got people who've worked there for 30 years or been at the church 30 years who are qualified, who are a woman or who are, you know, black or whatever, why they believe this set is the most qualified. I've listened to these conversations. So for me, once again, our society prides itself on being merit-based, the land of the free. Come here, work hard, you could be anything you want. The data not only supports the upper echelon being predominated by white males, but for the last 300 years, and I would say it's changing just because Mexican Americans are starting to be more predominant in some of these areas. But for a long time, the other end of the spectrum was predominated by black men, right? Illiteracy, incarceration, single parent households, poverty, you name it, you name it. And so the questions could be asked in reverse. Is it that black men are just worse at these things, or is the system rigged? I can handle either answer because to me, the follow-up is more interesting. If we investigate what's behind these trends, I think there's a lot that we can learn. Does that make sense? Let's get back to the last one. And then here's the O. Observe and identify who you are called to personally mentor in your life. I don't know when this struck me in this way, but I told you my company, we do leadership consultation. We sit down with small businesses. For like 4 years, I had like 300 employees as I helped run around Walmart's, and I've done a number of different things. And so we sit down and I can talk everything from, you know, supply chain to all of it, HR, contracts. But I've come to value leadership, and I've come to, if you guys see my leadership talk, it's way worse than this. I get way more excited. But in my definition of leadership, I've actually seen leadership as like the answer to like everything. Like leadership is kind of like the answer. And I think that as Christians, you're kind of obligated to this because the leader of your religion, Jesus Christ, came and mentored like 12 guys and then left and said, now you go mentor people. And, you know, and so like that was kind of like the whole point. But I think it's like missed a lot in society, and I've come to truly value it very deeply. Like as a young man, I had a lot of things troubling me, and I the only reason I'm standing before you today is because I could think of a white man, and it may get emotional, may not, we'll see. But I used to get him at 4 o'clock in the morning at the lowest parts, like when I had, like I said, siblings die. I've got both parents in the hospital. I've got different things going on in my life, and I remember getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and walking to my Caucasian weightlifting teacher's house. His name was Ethan. At 4 in the morning. Now think about this. In my neighborhood, it was just, you know, people were getting stabbed and shot. I had a car stolen right in front of my house. You know, my sister was suspended 16 times in 1 year for fighting. So I mean, it was like all that, right? But I walked to this guy's house, and some days I would sit there even in the snow. Like I would just sit there and it would like snow on me, and he'd honk and I'd like move to see where I was. And me and him would go to the school and lift until school started together. We just he's my football coach too. And he knew for me it was therapeutic. He knew like I needed that. Like I needed to get away from what I was going through. Like I couldn't even afford a football pad. Like I had to sell hot dogs by my football pads. And so he knew that like, and you know, he didn't take advantage of me. He wasn't a weirdo. Like he was just like this guy who just mentored me. He was like, I see goodness in you. You know, like I see that you're trying, but I see that life's handed you a bad hand of cards. You know, and so I want to be there. I want to help. So he used this lasso. He'd listen. I'd be in the car crying, venting about stuff. He'd listen. You know, he had self-reflected. He had committed in himself to make a difference. You know, in the school that he and I went to, I remember days where he'd have to physically hold kids down from fighting each other. We had bomb threats, all kind of stuff. But he still, with a busy schedule, he had 3 kids. He found the time to identify somebody he can make a difference in their life. A young black guy who he thought he could make a difference in his life. And now, because of his sacrifice, I'm not only about to have 1 master's degree, but I'm in active conversation with Duke for a second. You know, and it's because of him. He's a big reason why I was part of that. So if we want to talk about the way forward, after you've conceded on these points of what time is it? Oh, I got 6 minutes. I'm doing good. I'm cruising. After we've come to the point where we've allowed ourselves to be impacted by 365 years of something that happened in this country, right? After we allow ourselves to be impacted by longer than that. Where did I start? Apostle Paul. Millennia of oppression. That's where critical theory comes from, right? Oppression as a concept. We know there's integration. We know that things can change. That there are people in this world right now. We have AC, lights, clothes. There are people your age who are born, a few kilometers different from you in a different state, different country, who are being oppressed, who are being held against their will, who are being abused for no reason. That this stuff happens. That stuff matters. That stuff you wouldn't be the intellectual you are if you were born in that situation, right? That stuff matters. And so it's not just about black and white. What this is about human relations, right? Because what does race mean? Belonging to a group, and what do we all belong to? The human race. And so the way forward is that all 12 of you have a responsibility when you leave this room that I am putting on you. To leave, I'm gonna tell you to take a picture of this with your phone, do something, get a screen, get something of that on something that you own. And when you leave here today, to really allow yourself to sit with this stuff, okay? I know it will help. You've got a romantic interest or just a friend, it'll help you. But if you will start to, before you have another conversation about race, before you get mad about white privilege or systematic racism or anything else, before CNN gets your blood boiling about Black History Month or whatever it is, I'm challenging you to consider this. There are other points beneath this one. You need to leave them in a whole health. You need to allow genuine interaction. It doesn't work unless you know how to bring your true self to the relationship, and also doesn't work unless you challenge them. All of which he did for me and so many others. One of my final slides. Pandemics are real, whether or not you know someone who is sick. Racism is real, whether or not you are a racist. White privilege is real, whether or not you feel it. Police brutality is real, even if the cop you know is just. Your world is not the world. Everything's not about you. Point to deeper discussion we don't have time for today. Time periods, postmodernism, how view of race has evolved over time. All great discussion. That's it.